Two themes that have run throughout the symposium are equity and social justice, and with good reason. These issues are urgent to consider as we grapple, as individuals, communities, and nations, with the simultaneous crises of the COVID-19 pandemic, institutional racism, increasing social and economic inequity, and climate change, just to name a few. COVID-19, as with the epidemics, crises, and natural disasters that have preceded it, has amplified and exploited the social inequities in the societies across the world. Who gets sick, with what severity, why, and with what access to therapeutic resources, or even vaccination, is a function of social structures that too often have little to do with what's right or fair. If we learn anything from COVID-19, and especially from the sessions presented over the last 2 days, let it be this: we face an urgent need to seize this opportunity to create and inhabit more just, equitable, sustainable, and salutogenic cities. These ideas in mind, papers in this session will explore how the pandemic has exposed or exacerbated social and economic inequities, how the pandemic has affected in particular vulnerable or marginalized populations, including communities of color, migrants, refugees, and the elderly, how the epidemic has amplified racism across the world, the impacts of each on urban life and experience. In so doing, these presentations point to future priorities for social justice, equity, and inclusion in a post-COVID world. These presentations also illustrate the significance of having a global vision in addressing the issue of inequity, especially in a post-pandemic world. Moderating the session today is Dr. Irene Huang. Dr. Huang is a practicing architect as well as the Assistant Chair of Architecture at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. Dr. Huang has more than 15 years of experience in architecture and design and has worked in a variety of creative and strategic roles. She's currently working on her book entitled Get Practice, Turn Your Architectural Education into a Career, from Routledge, coming up in 2021.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. And I just want to really, thank everyone for making this such a welcoming space, and really, I guess, really appreciate the opportunity to talk about social justice and equity initiatives and thinking, especially in a conference about epidemic urbanism. And so, again, I realize this is the fourth round of this conference and symposium, and I just really appreciate all the work of the panelists that are about to present to you guys in the audience. And I appreciate them, especially because they bring together a real combination and diversity of perspectives, of lenses, of different conclusions and recommendations that I think really get to the spirit of what we are all looking to do in terms of understanding the inequities that are in our society and how those inequities play out in the built environment. So first, I want to, again, thank Melinda, Sandra, Amna, Timothy, Chelan, and George for their presentations. I've watched them already, so I got a sneak peek, and really excited to move forward through that. So I would love to introduce Melinda Silverman and Sandra Felix, who are joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa. And I want to just, highlight a little bit of their accomplishments. So Melinda is an architect and an urban designer. She has a degree in politics and architecture, and she, co-authored several various urban policy papers. And Sandra is a design lecturer, and she is also a practicing architect. So I think the combination of their expertise is really interesting because they are combining both the research realms as well as the practice realms. And they, again, are joining us from Wits University in Johannesburg, and they are presenting Responding to an Unequal Society through Agile and Adaptable Teaching Strategies in South Africa, which I found very interesting. So thank you.
Our presentation is entitled Responding to an Unequal Society Through Agile and Adaptable Teaching Strategies in South Africa. South Africa is notorious for being one of the most unequal societies in the world. The map on the right indicates South Africa having the highest Gini coefficient in the world. The image on the left shows the highly differentiated housing environments that characterize our landscape. The abrupt move to online learning threatened to deepen these divides. It made us realize that the studio was a space of freedom for our students, where students from different backgrounds could encounter each other and could encounter their lecturers.
the beginning of lockdown, we did a series of surveys which highlighted the three main areas of challenges that our students were experiencing. The first one was a lack of access to the CAD and computer labs that were on campus. The second one, a very high 32% of our students struggled with either data or bad connectivity. And over 25% of our students had a lack of workspace, the very need for that studio that Melinda was talking about earlier. What this meant was that over 25% of our students through most of lockdown were either failing or at risk of failing. Here a student shows us her living conditions. She lives in a very small flat with quite a large extended family in a low-income housing development on the outskirts of Johannesburg City. Here you can see her small bedroom that she shares with a sibling and where she needs to both sleep, entertain her friends, and do any of her university work. This beautiful drawing sent to us by a student was done on brown wrapping paper, simply because she didn't have access to white paper. So a lack of access to basic amenities for architectural students like pens, pencils, and white paper is something that's taken for granted, but not for our students who had to go back to quite rural areas. In South Africa, there is a very high incidence of unreliable electricity, poor connectivity, and unaffordable data. This is a WhatsApp conversation between student and design teacher where they highlight that they can't attend a lecture or a crit because they don't have any power. And when we ask them to message us when the power comes back on, they tell us that they're not sure if they're even going to have data when the power comes back on because their data is fast running out. Inadequate hardware and software was also a huge issue, with students not being able to access the CAD labs on campus. A lot of students didn't even have laptops, and those that had laptops had very low end laptops that were struggling to deal with the architectural softwares that architectural students and architects use. Here you can see a student just showing me how she's really struggling to do anything with her laptop, and it's causing huge frustration. The institutional response to lockdown was a number of initiatives. The first one was to standardize systems of teaching and to encourage everyone to use what they thought was the most effective online platforms, such as Microsoft Teams and Zoom, but these had very high data costs. They also wanted us to maintain student-teacher hierarchies and workloads as per pre-COVID arrangements. These responses, however, failed to acknowledge both the diversity of our students and the diversity of our student needs. We had a number of very student-led strategies that we started immediately in emergency online teaching. The first one was to proactively fundraise for both data and hardware, getting laptops or monitors to students and getting data packages to students. You can see by the correspondence from students shown on the right-hand side just how grateful these students are to be able to continue their online learning. What this meant, however, was that there was an intensification of communication between students and teachers that carried on into the night, very often outside working hours, mostly because data was much cheaper and is still much cheaper at night. All of this encouraged new forms of dialogue between students and teachers. On the left-hand side, you see a student who would draw on bump over her own drawings and then send us pictures with kind of little text messages as to what she was trying to do, and we would phone her back. On the right-hand side was a student who was really struggling with the spatial organization of a building and would send us these video clips taken with a cell phone. What we realized is that you can see here, there's a student who has access to high-end software. So we had to differentiate design excellence and extract it, irrespective of digital or analog methods. Because some of our students, like this student, didn't have access to hardware and software and was mostly reliant on model building and hand drawing to show us what it is that he was thinking and designing. And therefore, we needed to encourage and ascribe value to these analog methods as separate to the digital methods of the previous student. We did have students, however, as you can see by this student, who through model making and hand drawing were able to get to a very high quality of design.
So the learning for us was essential if we are not going to deepen the digital divide. First of all, we learned a number of lessons for the studio. The fact that teachers were able to mobilize funding in the face of COVID, but we are concerned that this might not be replicable in the future. We, I think, also were quite successful at facilitating and encouraging different modes of communication and different channels of communication. We learned to ascribe value to hand drawing and analog design thinking and not to be seduced by sexy digital drawings. And most importantly, we tried to create an enabling and supportive environment so that all of our students felt supported. There were also important conclusions for the university. The initial strategy of using a one-size-fits-all strategy was clearly not going to work. The university needs to acknowledge and support the diverse methods of learning and teaching, but also acknowledge that this involves extra work on the part of lecturers. The university also needs to acknowledge the importance of the studio itself as a physical workspace and the importance of bringing some students back to university to use this important amenity. And then the university needs to rethink its funding. If all students cannot access digital means, some students will inevitably fall behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. And I would like to basically just talk about really quickly to transition some of the things that really stuck out in my mind is just how quickly you know, the faculty of have to often think through how quickly education is being delivered. And I really appreciate the idea that those solutions are both fast and slow. So next I want to welcome Amna Shehazad, who will be presenting from, I think, Pakistan. And I want to just highlight some of her accomplishments. She is of our next generation, recent graduate of Beacon House National University, and also has completed some of her studies in Berlin, Germany. And I want to welcome her to present her presentation on pandemics and the exacerbation of social inequities in urban and formal settlements in Pakistan. Thank you so much.
Hello to everyone attending this online symposium. I'm delighted to be given this opportunity. Let us begin. Pandemics are also urban planning and design problems and have undoubtedly begun to expose social inequities around the world. History has highlighted numerous critical vulnerabilities in a society at the intersection of public health and urban design. Now that the world has faced an unprecedented change at the face of a global pandemic, the decision of urban planners, bureaucrats, and policymakers about urban informal settlements are being brought into question. As the world has braced itself with COVID-19, we have been instructed to wash our hands, observe social distance, and self-isolate. But what if I were to tell you that based on social inequity, you were unable to do these things? Please allow me to share with you some facts. The census of 2017 indicates an urban share of 75.6 million of a total of 207.8 million population of Pakistan. Furthermore, the United Nations stated in 2015 that the population living in informal settlements account up to 45.5% of total urban population. Therefore, by an estimate, 34 million Pakistanis are currently living in urban informal settlements where even the most basic needs are scarce. Let us now look speculatively upon Karachi, Pakistan's largest city and a host to a population of over 16 million. According to research, nearly 60% of these people live in informal settlements with insubstantial access to clean water or sanitation. The most basic of all given instructions in attempting to contain the spread of COVID-19 pandemic is washing our hands with soap repeatedly through the course of the day. While it sounds like a fairly simple task, it is next to impossible in Pakistan's informal settlements, as more often than not, they are deprived of clean drinking water. The access of water varies significantly based on factors like social inequality, unfair distribution of wealth, and class difference. According to research presented by Dawn reflecting upon Karachi's informal settlement of Machar Colony, it requires purchasing of water through water tankers. For poor households, frequent hand washing as a necessity in COVID-19 circumstances exposes inadequacy of cheap water provision. Furthermore, the exacerbation of social inequities, especially in regard to existing water infrastructure, has indicated an even larger problem. The reports of International Development Research Center conclude that a thorough inspection and repair is needed most urgently in urban planning to ensure infrastructure upgradation, especially when it comes to public health. This now brings me to my second point of discussion, the recommended measure of social distancing and its practicality in the existing spatial construct within these urban informal settlements. Karachi's urban lab analysis showed the impossibility of implementing social distance in informal settlements like Pathan Colony due to alarming levels of population density in an unjust distribution of space within the poorly planned urban setting. A research carried out shows that people are currently living in an average family size of 8 to 9 people in a plot size as small as 20 square yards. This hardly allows the accommodation of a single room, a kitchen, and a toilet. The safety and security of these urban residents, economically and health-wise, is under threat. More so during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially due to the plot size to density ratio. Considering the general lacking availability of space in the city fabric for the already vulnerable urban majority, the curfews and lockdowns have enforced confinement of these urban dwellers in small, dense, and unsanitary spaces. This brings me to my third point of discussion, that involves reflecting upon the health of the vulnerable. Urban informal settlements in Karachi are under a constant worry of eviction. According to resources at Dawn in Karachi's district central, over 1,000 households have been affected and rendered homeless. This has greatly contributed to eviction anxieties amongst urban residents and has caused to create increased levels of psychological stress. The implementation of lockdowns for the residents of these informal settlements has also widened the already present social and economic gap between classes. Factors contributing to inequality and social injustice also contribute to uncertainty, insecurity, and stress, resulting in compromised immunity of the already vulnerable population to become even more vulnerable in COVID-19 circumstances. Please allow me to sum up my case studies and research with a few observations and recommendations. The lacking accountability of a fragmented governance has obstructed inclusive planning processes. Planners, designers, and policymakers can no longer overlook these informal settlements. Moving forward, emphasis should be laid to ameliorate urban infrastructure and provide both urgent and long-term solutions with strong prioritization of social equity amongst the vulnerable population, as highlighted especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. These densely populated areas and their increasingly unsanitary environments has accounted for devastating impacts not only on the health but also on the livelihood. Normalized and overlooked practices of social injustice, now more than ever, would leave the whole city, if not the whole country, at risk, if not addressed most promptly. Therefore, restoration of local government to promote participatory planning processes in urban development, coordination with community representatives, and a prioritization of emergency budgets to ensure provisions of cheap water in these urban informal settlements would be the way forward in these desperate and demanding times. Thank you for your attention. Hello to everyone attending.
So I just wanted to highlight some things that stuck out to me about Amna's presentation. And I think one of the main thoughts that I think is significant is the idea that there is a real tension between solutions and strategies that may be applicable in one context and completely, we would say, useless in another. And so I think this is also a real point in terms of thinking about social equity, social justice in our built environment, and how we as both architects, urbanists, thinkers, practitioners, researchers, how we are queuing ourselves up to contribute to that variety of work. And so next I want to welcome Timothy Ojel, who is joining us from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. And I want to again highlight some of Timothy's accomplishments. So he is head of the Department of Architecture at the University of Ibadan. He also holds a PhD in architecture from the University of Lincoln in England. And I hope that we are able to celebrate some of his other accomplishments, but I do want to introduce his paper and his presentation, which is titled Reinterpretation of Traditional Urban Space, Social Justice, and Power Relations in Post-COVID Lagos, Nigeria.
We are looking at Lagos in the post-COVID situation. We're looking at the impact of reinterpretation of the urban space. Lagos is the most populous city in Nigeria and the African continent. Lagos is located close to the Atlantic Ocean, and it is the former capital of Nigeria shortly after our independence, and then the capital was moved to Abuja, as seen in Figure 1. But Lagos is regarded as a commercial capital of Nigeria, and it's a major financial center and economic hub for the whole of Africa. In fact, 1 out of 5 Nigerian, 1 out of 5 Black person is a Nigerian. So that means if you are looking at Nigeria, if you look at Lagos, then you can as well understand what is happening more or less, to a Nigerian or to the African continent as a whole. So the population of Lagos grew from 267,400 in 1952, a small one, to roughly 665,000 people in 1963 at a rate of 8.6% per annum. And United Nations conducted a study in 1995 and discovered that Lagos is the number 29 largest urban center in the whole world with 6.5 million people. And that certainly moved to 23rd position in the millennium, in the year 2000, to 8.8 million people. And they now projected that by 2025, Lagos will have 18.9 million people, which is even bigger than Cairo. So that makes Lagos very important study point for us to consider. And Lagos, as this is entry port to Nigeria, so to say, it has a seaport. It has a lot of road network that linked the whole of West Africa, the ECOWAS bloc, and even by extension to the Sahel part of Africa. So Lagos is an important, as I said, to look at. Next slide, please. So when we talking about traditional urban spaces, we are talking about public squares. We're talking about food markets. We're talking about streets. We're talking about city core neighborhoods. And most of our cities in Africa mirrored our traditional sensibilities. So the tradition is locked in most of our spaces. So and we need to understand that for us to study and to look at the impact of coronavirus, for instance, in the post-COVID age, we must talk about these spaces and how they influence our lifestyle and vice versa. What we discover in the current situation is that the first world is only talking to itself. The outbreak of the coronavirus, for some reason, social justice was forgotten. The aspect of "I'm your brother's keeper," axiom is more or less forgotten. The developed nation think more of themselves. The big nations bought all the vaccines, and they usually ignore the developing world. So the world has a responsibility to include the others, so to say, in a post-COVID discord. So we must not ignore Africa, because we discovered that 70% of the population in Lagos are below the age of 40. So the future of the world, or the workforce of the world, is in Africa. So we have to think of them. We have to plan about them. So, and they occupy these traditional urban spaces that we talk about. So at the moment, there's no clear health policy to isolate and treat working class people, the urban poor, and how they mediate or use traditional urban spaces that we are talking about. Next slide, please. So the findings that I got from my recent research to the fact that many of these urban space users are disfranchised by the prevalence of the pandemics. Most of them cannot go to work, they are locked down, they are isolated, and they use these urban spaces, these traditional urban spaces, for their livelihood, but they are cut off from it because of this pandemic. So, as I said, 70% of the Lagos population are below the age of 40 and were deprived of a voice. Because of this, they have to react. The government is not planning for them, refuse to do things for them, and even the money paid for COVID-19 tests is beyond them. The treatment is so exorbitant. For instance, 300,000 naira is charged for these, specialized clinics. So that is beyond the large population. So that suggests justice is not being done. Many are forgotten. The equity aspect is being forgotten. And for us to have a wholesome development, as shown in that figure 3, the polity must respond to these 7 dimensions of sustainable development. You must think about the culture, about the politics. Those things has to be considered. The spiritual aspect, the human development, the ecological, everything must come together. We must not think of one and neglect the other. Society must be taken care of in our discourse to be able to understand how to undo the breakout pandemics in the developing world. Next slide, please. So that points to what we call the power relations among these various segments of society. The working class people, the middle class people, the elites, they have a kind of a relationship. I discovered from my, recent studies that the elite have more access to specialized hospitals in highbrow Lagos, and the people in the deprived zones have no access, at all to these specialized hospitals. So the elite think more of themselves, which is a shame. So the aspect of social justice is absent because of this prevalence of the post-COVID outbreak. So African countries as a whole have no clear-cut path to vaccination, as we see. Even at the moment, the current, issue going on around African countries. So this is sad. And we are even told that just 20% of Africans are expected to be vaccinated by year 2021. That's even by the WHO, saying that by the end of 2021, only just 20%. So this is aspect of power relations that we're talking about between the first world and the third world, developed world and developing world. And then embedded in it is aspect of social justice, as shown in that diagram, figure 4, the Shakpati diagram of urban network in relationship, where we see the size of the Shakpati, and that's a kind of pie chart that shows the power relationship between various segments, the shoppers, the traders, the market women, the infrastructure aspects, and how they're able to influence one another. Proper understanding of this will help us to handle the post-COVID society very well. Next slide. In conclusion, our core memories are locked in traditional urban spaces in the developing world. Our culture are found there, and they are impacted by the continuous transformation brought about by these pandemics. So there's no way we can run away from it. So to understand how to handle, to contain this epidemic, we must actually understand these traditional urban spaces and know how to handle them very well. So, and that will translate to reality on ground in terms of having provision of quality infrastructures, which is lacking at the moment. Basic health facilities, not only for the elite in the highbrow Lagos that they can only afford, but thinking of how to, distribute and bring down facilities to the common people in the traditional urban spaces, in the food markets, in the streets, in the lockdown, city core neighborhoods. You must see how we can help them through proper transportation, through basic education and enlightenment, so that it can lead to containment and eventual eradication of these disease. So that is taken for granted in the developed world. In Europe, as a bloc, or Britain here, we have the safety nets that everybody have access to, health and COVID tests without being asked to pay any money. But over there in Africa, for you to be tested for COVID, you must pay, and the money is not even cheap. It's so exorbitant, and these are the kind of social justices that is impacting on the urban people and the use of their spaces and non-use of their spaces. So we need to understand that planned and built environments must carry the seed of social justice for it to be successful. Thank you.
So thank you, Timothy, for your presentation on really outlining just how difficult strategies for a healthy built environment are and for a healthy society are, but especially for highlighting how complex and how much coordination needs to happen between these highly complex considerations. And I'm really excited to hear in the discussion how we might address some of those gaps. How do we begin to navigate the deficiencies that are in our current systems? And then also, how do we acknowledge the built environment as something that is also as alive as much as the people are alive, and that is subject to change almost as rapidly as our society is changing. So with that, I want to introduce the final presentation for this particular session. And I want to first introduce Chelen Pashalar, who is an associate professor of landscape architecture and environmental planning. She's also the assistant dean for research and extension at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. And her co-presenter is George Hallowell, an assistant professor of practice in the School of Architecture at North Carolina State University, also in Raleigh. And George has a doctorate in design from North Carolina State University. So again, I want to welcome the co-presenters, especially because of the combination of their expertise and how they are able to bring that expertise to play in a common discussion about an examination about shared, accessible, and healthy streets in post-pandemic American cities.
Our current research explores how the COVID-19 pandemic has altered the way that people socialize, travel, and experience their neighborhoods, streets, and public spaces. This presentation will particularly focus on the challenges that many of our cities are facing today. We will highlight the importance of shared, accessible, and healthy streets in high to low density urban areas, and further consider what this means for post-pandemic cities. The idea of converting urban streets into shared, accessible, and healthy environments for public use, in other words, recovering a street space from the car, is not a new idea. For example, Boston developed complete street guidelines in 2013 with suggestions for physical layouts that reduce car dominancy. Other cities have adopted shared street programs that include living, open, or complete street approaches and human-centered, healthy and green street design strategies. COVID-19 has certainly accelerated this trend in many US cities. During the pandemic, some streets were converted into shared corridors that encourage improved safety and healthy activity. These corridors with limited car access resulted in increased space for distance outdoor dining, biking, recreation, and walking. Streets as outdoor spaces have a new meaning now, but we need to ask the question, how are they changing? And will they become more accessible to all citizens post-pandemic? Keeping all this in mind, we will look at how these concepts and related strategies are being utilized, expanded, and accelerated during the pandemic. The first concept to consider is the rapid deployment of shared streets. On the left side of this slide, we see busy urban streets in Chicago and Brooklyn, showing us conditions before and during the pandemic. Navigating narrow sidewalks while attempting to stay 6 feet away from others can be tricky, as we attempt to walk around signs and other sidewalk furniture. Such obstacles can be especially difficult to navigate for people with mobility or vision impairments. The need for social distancing is even more challenging when the streets have only a sidewalk on one side or none at all. Shared street initiatives are intended to give people and businesses more room in the streets, transforming road areas reserved for driving or parking into pedestrian zones. Where sidewalks are too narrow for physical distancing, they're extended into the road. With more pedestrian area, it is easier for users to move safely through the streets while maintaining appropriate distance from one another. Many restaurants and retail businesses are also relying on curbside access and a space for outdoor dining. By opening the streets to people and providing flexibility for other users, opportunities are created for safe outdoor dining, retail, exercise, walking, and social engagement.
Accessibility is crucial to the success of any public space, especially in promoting diversity and inclusion. When shared streets are created with equity and accessibility in mind, they allow residents living in under-resourced neighborhoods, older adults, and people with disabilities to have an equal opportunity to use the street space. Shared streets can greatly enhance access to critical community amenities, such as food stores, pharmacies, and medical offices. A Chicago study shows that some residents have no pharmacies or grocery stores within walking distance of their home, and many residents don't own cars and suffer health conditions such as diabetes. Easy access to such resources is also crucial during a pandemic, as COVID vaccine distribution can occur through pharmacies. Limited access to critical services such as healthy food is an ongoing problem for many communities due to a lack of well-designed streets. The middle image of a neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina, shows half-mile walkable circles around food stores in red and blue lines of available sidewalks. Many areas are not walkable, lack sidewalks, and have limited access to food or services. In neighborhoods such as these, providing shared streets can increase access to local services and healthy food beyond the pandemic. When walking, biking, and public transit are convenient and flexible, cities can experience higher levels of safety, social cohesion, environmental quality, accessibility, and equity, also helping residents improve their mental and physical well-being. In response to COVID-19, cities like Boston and Seattle have accelerated their work to improve street safety and transit as a part of their Healthy Streets program, which aim to give residents better access to jobs, neighborhood retail centers, and open spaces. As they allow access and continued use of parks, farmers markets, and greenways, cities are converting portions of existing streets and public spaces with the hope of keeping people moving and healthy. The challenge of providing equal access to safe streets, sidewalks, parks, and other public spaces still exists for many cities. For example, in Oakland, 48% of residential parcels in the city were within a 5-minute walk of park or public space before the crisis. But with the rollout of slow or shared streets, a further 24% of homes are now within a 5-minute walk of a slow street, and 12% of residents have access to a public space within walking distance for the first time. A recent Gallup survey found that existing public streets in many neighborhoods lack safe or wide enough sidewalks for social distancing. A majority of respondents use roads and sidewalks for recreation and exercise. Streets are no longer just about moving between destinations. People are using streets and sidewalks as their destination. Spending time on the street was an important factor for their mental health. During the pandemic, people are rediscovering how important public spaces are, how much they rely on them to relax, exercise, and get fresh air and sunshine. The use of shared streets has increased with new activities and forms of urban life emerging. But streets, sidewalks, and other public spaces are not always accessible by everyone. Social distancing and mobility limitations can further exacerbate these inequities, so care must be taken to provide equal and easy access. However, reviews of temporary shared streets are largely positive. In a survey of the Oakland program, 77% of respondents said that they were in support of the Slow Streets effort, and 95% said they would continue to use slow streets even after COVID. In another survey in Chicago, 66% of the respondents wanted more shared streets to have the program continue into the next year. The fact that streets were closed to traffic almost overnight during the pandemic allowed people to experience shared streets on a temporary basis, perhaps lending support for a more permanent solution. For cities adapting to emerging forms of mobility over the last decade, now might be a good time to get public feedback on ways to use streets without first spending construction money. Cities can also learn what design components of a shared street are most successful and which features provide the most equitable and sustainable solutions.
Thank you, Chelan and George, for your presentation. What comes to my mind is, the power of architecture beyond the production and implementation of buildings, but actually to reconsider again the complexities of how human occupation, human life occurs, and to really think through, a concept like slow streets and how that can actually how the power of reprogramming our physical spaces is as potent as the redesign of a complete infrastructure or the redesign of a city area. So in terms of the moderator response, you'll see me guys looking, you guys will see me looking a little bit at my notes, and I wanted to just give you a little bit of my background to maybe help contextualize a little of my interest in social justice and in equity, and why that is something relevant to my particular expertise, which is in architecture. And so I think I've always been, I was looking back to some of my earlier thoughts on architecture when I first became an architecture student. And I was looking back to my graduate school essay in which I wrote, I hope that I'm able to use architecture to communicate with and contribute to society. And I think that really goes to the core of why I see strength in the built environment as something as powerful and as necessary as government, as law, as economics, as health. I think all of those things are radically intertwined and profoundly intertwined. And so I really appreciate this panel. I really appreciate this topic being included as part of the epidemic urbanism. I wanted to talk through kind of 5 points. And the first one is the idea that one size doesn't fit all. When we're thinking about solutions, or we're thinking about tactics to deal with injustice, to deal with inequity, there is a real reliance on our current, our current society, I would say global, to look toward technical answers, to look toward technical expertise. And I would say that again, that one size fits all is also a kind of myth of the power of a single solution to really create lasting change, and change that is also flexible and dynamic. The second question or maybe thought I'd like to pose to the panel and also to the audience is this idea or this struggle, what I see a tension between ambition and observations, basically what's going on and how can we change it? And then obviously for me, the tension really relies with implementation. So one example that comes to mind that's happening in the United States is that, the great idea is to have a vaccine, a COVID vaccine and several COVID vaccines, but the actual hard work comes in, the real struggle comes in when we're trying to understand how we actually get those shots into people's arms. How do we actually deliver and get to the end of that process? And again, you will see the obstacles created by inequity. You will see the problems created by these kind of structural differences in access to resources. The third one, this leads me to my third point, which is structures of inequity. And if we talk about architectural infrastructure, built infrastructure, the urban infrastructure, I don't think that can be separate from these structural, cultural, psychosocial infrastructures that we also have that may be invisible in terms of our core expertise in these more technical or formal or built solutions, but are no less important. And I think in that sense, to me, I also appreciate something as simple as this, as all of our participants participating in this conference in English, because English has become the language of science, has become the language of intellectual or scholarly work. And that is also an inequity. That is also something that we are struggling with. I remember a recent anecdote that I heard where where China was actually thinking of no longer using their traditional written language or written script in order to accommodate or be able to plug into the Western technology boom. And so, you know, how do they contend with inputting Chinese characters in a QWERTY keyboard? So again, these inequities are resonant for all aspects of, you know, humanity, of human existence. The fourth point I'd like to make is a little bit riffing off of what I was thinking, what I mentioned before was just these divides, these gaps. Some of our presentations really emphasized the gaps that are, again, really prohibiting us from understanding how to combat inequity. And again, these resources, how do we plug into these resources? How do we begin to build or rebuild these structures through a more equitable structure? So those divides come in the form of money, they come in the form of the rural-urban divide, they come in the form of young and older adults, religion, cultural customs and traditions. So all of these things, again, form part of society, but I would also posit are really integral to our built environment. And lastly, I would just like to highlight for your guys' consideration, the battle also that I see between simplification and complexity. So as we have seen throughout the all 2 days of presentations, there are incredibly complex layered ideas that we are grappling with. And those have solutions that are also complex and layered. And I'm wondering from our you know, contributors' perspective, from our audience perspective, how do you guys, how are you dealing with this struggle between a real desire towards simple, immediate answers that make sense, and the actual complexity of the society and the kind of the problems we're dealing with, as well as the potentials and futures that we see for us. So I would love to invite my fellow panelists to turn on their cameras, and I think I would love to actually start off with a question that we have from the Q&A box, and please feel free to drop questions in. I realize that this is an ongoing conversation, but I think our first question is directed for Amna, and it is about, you know, could slum upgrading be a solution to urban informality, and how could standard housing be provided?
Thank you so much for addressing this question, and I was just waiting till the Q&A to answer this question. So like you said, this is like a very sort of diverse sort of settings that we see all around the world. So maybe my answer would not be justified to be placed in every setting, every solution, but I can always, you know, speak about what I think would work in our local context. So generally, we do see practices of regulating building standards coming into play. We see how slums are being afflicted to urban settlements. We see low-cost housing coming into play. We see incremental housing coming into play. We see a lot of vernacular building materials and building methodologies being, you know, used all across to sort of try and cater this very sort of complicated process. And like you said, that all of these issues that we are facing they're complex, they're layered. So we do not have one specific answer to them. We need to accommodate both the tangible and the intangible aspects of the infrastructure to begin to cater to these, you know, problems that we're facing. And again, we need to basically emphasize that there are some short-lived solutions that are perhaps being catered to at the moment, but at the same time, we do need to come up with long-term solutions for these sort of problems that we have started to face and started to realize, rationalize, and see that they're exacerbating within this, you know, as soon as COVID hit us. So I think that is one answer of the many possible answers to the question that has been asked.
That is really helpful. And I know we have some other questions in the queue, but I actually wanted to prompt Sandra and Melinda, because I just appreciate how much you were able to also, like Amna, think through these short-lived solutions, these on-the-fly solutions. You were really, you know, hacking through the system of teaching, right? And facing all of these again, inequities and accesses that are, I also find, very culturally grounded. So for instance, in the US, we have different ways of understanding data. And I was really struck by how you ended up having to shift your schedules to accommodate students that could have bigger or higher bandwidth in the evening. And I hope you guys don't mind me actually prompting you to speak a little bit again, also in relation to Amna's work, is just how quick how quick you had to be, how agile you had to be, and also are some of those solutions more long-standing or more short-lived?
So maybe I can jump in and then Sandra can talk too. I think we jumped in very quickly and we did have to be very agile. I was completely sort of distressed. We had a staff meeting about 3 days ago, and the immediate response from the university after a year of having to be adaptable and agile and responsive to our student needs, once again, the attitude was, how can we standardize? How can we find a solution, one solution that's going to work for everybody? So that the kind of institutional pressures for standardization are immense. And I think that was that's going to be the constant struggle that we're going to have to fight. I also just want to make one point which I think works across all of the presentations, and particularly in the developing world, and particularly maybe in relationship to what Amna just had to say, is I think the strategies that we have to think about are strategies that support the urban commons rather than the individual units. So for me, when Amna talks about slum upgrading, I think less about the individual house than I think about let's say, a communal water collection point, similar to the last presentation on slow roads, and similarly to the role that our studio played. It's a commonage, and it needs to be supported in every possible way. I hand over to Sandra.
Yeah, I agree with Melinda. We had to become extremely experimental, but actually just student-led. It was a unique situation, and we had to really just follow our students where they needed to go, where they could go, the times that they were available, from WhatsApp to telephone calls. That's what we had to do. So I agree with Melinda, and I agree with you, Irene, when you say, one size does not fit all. One of the projects we did last year with our students when COVID hit was like a COVID project. We thought, okay, let's understand what are all the problems that they're facing. And one of the interesting things that came out, Amna, and maybe it relates very much to your presentation, was what we found in some of the urban informal settlements, especially in and around Johannesburg, that there was this incredible public water infrastructure. In other words, just the very fact that 4 households were sharing a water point actually meant that that water point was publicly available to anyone who walked past and needed to wash their hands. It was something that actually, counter to what we were thinking, was not available in the more formal areas of our city, but was readily available in the more informal areas of our city, but urban areas. Obviously, the rural areas, they were dealing with the same issues that Amna was talking about, having to bring water very long distances from kind of rivers, etc. But it did mean that you needed to look at places in a different light. You couldn't make any assumptions. You needed to be, like Melinda said, agile, resilient, and very experimental. Put aside everything that you thought teaching was about and just kind of one day at a time, go where the students needed you to go.
And I think that that's a great segue, right? This idea that you have to just jump in and you have to be so agile and to think quickly. And I'd love to actually, pose a question to Timothy. And it's a little, if you guys don't mind bearing with me, it's a little bit of a mashup between some of the questions we've gotten online from our audience and also some of my own personal interests. But, again, we were talking a little bit, I think, Timothy, your project or your presentation really highlighted this idea of gaps, right? This idea that there are these mismatches between government, there are mismatches between the young and the old, there's mismatches between the first world and the developing world. And so I wonder what you think about how social equality and things like functional justice might be achieved in these kind of complex socioeconomic environments. I mean, I love the chapati diagram because it was just so significant about just how many factors people who are dealing with the built environment are thinking about. And I think, again, we are competing with that simplification idea where people think that those of us working in the built environment are just thinking about a particular building and that particular system. And so what are some of your thoughts, Timothy, in terms of those gaps and the complexity? What are some of the future tactics that might be in play, especially in Lagos?
Yes, I think we have to. Thank you very much for the question. We have to think of the world as a community. The global south and the global north, they have to talk together. This issue that we have the developed world having all the vaccine, for instance, and up till now, nobody is talking about Africa. I know we have government in Africa, but they're inequal. This gap is there, and the reality, we're in the same world, we're in the same planet. We can't take the rocket out of the world and go to the moon and go and live there. We're all on planet Earth. And the air is going from Africa to Europe, back to America. We are connected one way or the other. So there must be a concerted effort from the World Organization, like WHO, like United Nations, to interfere in our part of the world to ensure that the less privileged are actually taken care of. We have to think of them, the urban poor. They are human beings, for crying out loud. So if the government of that country or the countries we are talking about are not doing anything for the urbans, for the cities, the world government must come to our aid. Because people are there and they are dying. They are not being reported. For one, corruption is evident everywhere in our part of the world. So it's a reality in architecture and urban development and city development in our part of the world. What do we do? It's a question for all. I don't have the answer because it's very complex. But we can start somewhere. We can appeal to our morality. The developer must, how do I put it now, release some of those things, the hate they have, not in terms of money now, but vaccines, for crying out loud. I heard, even this morning I was hearing in Al Jazeera news that Eurobloc is blocking exporting of the vaccine to other parts. Some nations have 4 times vaccine that they even need. And Nigeria, for instance, we don't even have 1 drop of vaccine in Nigeria. As I'm talking, talk of Nigeria is even well to do. What about the West Bloc? Togo is there, Benin Republic is there, we have Guinea Republic, we have Mali, we have those, and they have nothing, neither. So what can we do to help them? Not only in terms of giving them vaccine, but education, enlightenment, knowing that they are part of the world group, and to influence the city's development for the future, for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Timothy, I really appreciate that, especially because I do think, highlighting the fact that the global South, the global North need to talk to each other. There's this real, these walls that come up between these different groups, right? And so yes. I think one of the fundamental struggles I see is how people from different groups with different priorities are communicating with each other and trying to work out how to take hold of one big pot of resources, right? And again, yes. the global kind of political environment is so crucial, I think, to how we make space and how we make healthy environments. And so I'm actually curious of how this links to Chelen and George's presentation in particular, because I'm curious, how did you guys see the US cities, which we know are well-funded and well-connected, but yet our federated system, our government, and our kind of the psychosocial dialogues going on in our communities are leading to really diverse opinions about how shapes should be, spaces should be shaped. How did you guys find the different cities were able to implement these on the fly or very rapid reprogrammings of their streets? And I guess this would also link to another question that we have from our audience, which asks us to consider, again, the healthy streets in the US, but how also these strategies might be implemented in other areas in South Africa, Pakistan, and Nigeria, or not at all. So maybe Chelen and George, you might talk a little bit about what were some of the resources, what was the mechanism that these cities used to create this? What were they drawing from?
I think a lot of what we presented in the show that we did in the PowerPoint was information that we got both locally and we saw nationally. And I kind of want to divert slightly because I wanted to speak up to something that Melinda brought up, which is the use of the commons, and also addresses something that Anna and Timothy talked about, and that, you know, these are solutions that were right for maybe mid-sized to larger US cities, but it's not new information. This idea of expanding the commons and using slow streets and common street space for the common good is happening all over. I was recently in Kailesha near South Africa, near Cape Town in South Africa, and a lot of these lessons that we're learning now for our mid-sized cities in the US, they're already doing there, having street spaces that convert during the day to stores and pharmacies and food spaces is already happening. And it's interesting to see this knowledge that we're gaining is you know, we're all gaining it in a different way, and we're making use of it as we can. But it's interesting how this extends to all people, just in different ways.
Yeah, so Chelen, as the co-presenter, what were your thoughts on just the differences between the cities? Because again, I think one of the things I'm also curious about is dispelling the one size fits all, or that maybe these ideas can be perfectly exportable to other places. So what was some of the nuance? What were some of the nuances that you noticed with the different cities?
I think, I mean, the differences were in comparison among some of the cities that we looked into, that some of them were more conscious about what already people are doing or asking for. So they observed, I mean, the officials particularly, they observed what people are doing, how they're using the spaces during, particularly when there was lockdowns. And the usage of some of the public spaces around it was the home environment that people were still allowed to have access to. And also, again, cities actually started to listen, not just to observe, but also listen what really people want. So I think that's what made the difference, that some of the simple solutions emerge organically from people's behaviors, changing, evolving behaviors, and cities started to apply it. And some of the cities, again, maybe it might relate to because they are resourceful, they have been able to, you know, carry it over now to figure out actually much longer term solutions after you know, COVID is over, hopefully too. So I would say, I mean, it has been more about really how the communication has been happening between people and the governing agencies.
Yeah, I hope we learn from this and can move forward with what we've learned.
So I want to hand this over to Caitlin and Mohammed. I see them popping up in my window. And I just want to thank you, everyone, for bearing with us for our extra 4 minutes. You're very generous. And I just really want to be so appreciative of this panel.